Well, welcome to our afternoon session where we are beginning to explore the theme of understanding our missionary context, and we'll be exploring that in two ways, in this plenary session and then in some workshops which I'll explain a little more about at the end of our session today. This conference would not be possible without the generous sponsors who have supported us, and they are Ridley College, Moore College, Compassion, Anglican Church League, Anglican Aid, the Anglican Relief and Development Fund Australia, the Bush Church Aid, Anglican Deaconess Ministries, and we're very thankful to them for their support. Would you please thank them? In particular, we have three platinum sponsors, and I would like to invite Mark Thompson, who is the principal of Moore College, to come and speak on behalf of one of our platinum sponsors. Would you give him a very warm welcome?
Thanks, Brett. Friends, as Richard said, my name is Mark Thompson. I'm the principal of Moore Theological College in Sydney. Since its opening in 1856, Moore College has been committed to preparing people to serve the cause of Christ in Sydney and around the world. Today, around 300 men and women are studying full-time at our college, hundreds more in our part-time courses, and thousands in our global correspondence and online programs. But we are still about seeing the gospel of Jesus and the salvation he has won for us proclaimed in all the world. And that's why we're very, very pleased to be one of the sponsors of this event. Moore College has been committed to GAFCON and the Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans right from its beginnings. We want to stand with our brothers and sisters around the world who love Christ, who love his word, who love his people, and are willing to suffer rather than compromise on biblical truth and the obedience that flows out of the gospel. Australian Anglicans cannot afford any longer, as if we really ever could, we cannot afford just to keep busy in our own little patch and let the world worry about itself. We are connected to those who are Christ's in other parts of Australia and in other lands. We must stand together, encouraging each other, supporting each other, sharing our resources with each other. The Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans brings each of us into a network that spans the globe. At Moore College, we have vital partnerships with Anglican theological educators in Chile, Egypt, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Namibia, South Africa, Singapore, Myanmar, India, the United Kingdom, and the United States. We're helping to provide the next generation of theological leaders in those countries and seeking to resource this current generation with curriculum assistance, with postgraduate study and research scholarships, with faculty exchanges, and with much more. We are working as partners rather than working as those with all the answers. We've learnt much, and we've had our vision enlarged and our perspectives changed by what we've been taught by our brothers and sisters in other places. In the bag that was on your seats, when you arrived, you will find a brochure that will tell you more about our college, who we are, how we are involved in the FCA and the FCA's dream. There is a lot more for us all to do together, for those in need and under pressure in other parts of Australia and other parts of the world. This new fellowship is an important step forward. We mustn't let it take our eyes off the real centre and the purpose of things, though, which is Jesus Christ himself and his gospel. It would be all too easy for us to take even this good thing and make an idol of it, as we do with so many of the good things that God has given us. The Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans Australia must first and foremost be about the gospel, not about itself. And our theological colleges have an important part to play in the journey that lies ahead. Our colleges and our seminaries are our future. In London at the FCA conference several years ago, person after person from dioceses where gospel ministry was under extraordinary pressure confessed that the rot had set in decades before in their theological college. Our colleges must be mission-focused and not just focused on the academy. They must have as their continuing priority seeing Christ honoured as Saviour and Lord in all the world. We, to be quite honest, are not even scratching the surface when it comes to reaching Australia for Christ. We need to work together to do that as we wait for the day when every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And that's why Moore College is very, very glad to be playing a part alongside many others in this vital and important launch of FCA Australia over these next 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, without further ado, we're going to move into our session now about understanding our missionary context. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the host of this session, the Reverend Tracy Lauersen. Tracy is the Senior Associate Minister in the St Hilary's Church Network here in Kew in Melbourne, and she is also the Director of the Peter Corney Training College, Training Institute, Training Centre. What are you? Centre. The Peter Corney Training Centre, which is doing a marvellous job in running training courses for people right around Australia. I need to say, it's got nothing to do with this session, but I need to say that the Peter Corney Training Centre have been the people who have organised this entire conference, and I just happened to be looking at the deleted items in my mail inbox the other day and realised that I have about 5,000 emails that Tracy and I have exchanged over the last couple of months, so please pray for her. Would you welcome Tracy as she leads us off today?
Thank you, Richard. We're hoping that we might have a couple of minutes at the end of this session for questions. So if you've got a question, can you tweet it to the hashtag #AFuture15, and we will try and answer one or two questions. They can be for any of the four speakers in this session. All right. Hands up if anyone knows what that is. I think you have to be over about 40 years of age to recognise that. It's a Smith Corona, and it's a classic, number 12. And Smith Corona were one of the great names in office technology. They made typewriters from 1886 through to 1995, and the company survived until about 2001. They didn't manage the transition to computers. Now, anyone under 40 probably these days wouldn't even recognise the name. They might think it was a beer brand, Corona. It's only us oldies who recognise it. And that's because they didn't transition. And why not? Well, Smith Corona initially couldn't understand why customers would possibly want to pay more for a product that did the same thing as their typewriters at the time. They could understand typewriters getting better, and so they moved into the electronic phase, but not that the whole product itself would be replaced entirely. They were committed to being in the typewriter business and no other business. But actually, they weren't really in the typewriter business, were they? They were in the communication business. They were in the business of helping people to put words down and communicate them. A similar fate for the other big company at the time, Olivetti, two great names from the past. And then I've got a third one, Kodak. One of the world's most valuable brands. At its peak, it had 90% of the US film market. But instead of listening and observing their context, their customers, their very success made them resistant to change. You would be surprised to know that they manufactured the first digital camera in 1975. And they decided to hold it back in order to protect their film business, which they saw was much more valuable. They believed that they were in the film business, but really they were in the storytelling business, the memory keeping business. And then there's the Anglican Church. Can we be responsive to a changing world? What kind of enterprise are we? Are we simply one of those full-service organisations that is heavily invested in real estate? Or are we in the business of making disciples? Obviously, we're in the business of making disciples. But like Smith Corona, like Kodak, and any established organisation, we face a real challenge to clarify our mission and to respond to the changing context in which we minister. So this session is all about our changing context. We want to understand the shifts in society so we can respond and proclaim the gospel in ways that can be understood now. We want to adapt the gospel. We don't want to surrender it, but we do want to contextualise it. We want to apply it in ways and in language that people today can understand. Our title, Our Missionary Context, draws our attention that in times gone by, when we said the word mission, people thought that that was something you went overseas to do, a special calling to cross-cultural mission, lots of preparation and language learning. Ironically, a bit of language learning wouldn't hurt us now, right in our own country. Now, the mission field, it feels like, has come to us. Australia is such a diverse, multicultural society thanks to immigration. But not only is it multicultural in terms of ethnic groups that have come to call this place home, even long-settled Australians with 3 or 4 generations here present have their own subcultures, their own beliefs and values, their own class-differentiated characteristics and ways of understanding the world. Australia really is a mission field. It always was, of course. And if you looked on one of those many emails that came through your inbox, there was the first sermon that was preached in Australia and in New Zealand. And if you read those, you would understand that it was a mission field right then. But perhaps even 50 years ago, mission in Australia wasn't so complicated. It wasn't so diversified. Our society wasn't so fragmented. Nevertheless, that call to us to be part of God's mission in this world, to make disciples and to baptise them, to immerse them into a relationship with Father, Son and Spirit, applies to us now in our contemporary, sunburnt, lucky country. Now, even CMS are onto this. I looked at their website and they're advertising a short course called Going Global. It's a short course for local Australian parishes, tailored for them, and in it, quote, you will learn more about the how and what of mission. You'll be trained to more effectively reach out to your neighbours and your friends from different cultural backgrounds. So even CMS are onto that, and they're training people in our own country for mission. And in our own country, our mission here is a very tough calling. Leslie Newbigin, who is arguably the missionary statesman of the 20th century, he was a missionary in India, and then in his retirement, he looked after a parish in Bristol in England. He said, mission in any Western country is the most challenging frontier of our time. Mission in any Western country is the most challenging frontier of our time, and he said that several decades ago. And one of the reasons it's so challenging is because our culture is so complex, so many subcultures. Tim Foster, who has recently published this terrific book, The Suburban Captivity of the Church, which you can purchase up there, reflected on his parish ministry, and he says this: I recall the day when we arrived in the inner city parish of Leichhardt, fresh from the suburbs. We climbed out of our four-wheel drive, and my 8-year-old son Harry stood and stared. His attention was first captured by the beggar across the street accosting passers-by with her trademark, "You got $1, mister?" He'd never seen anyone homeless, let alone begging. As a low-flying plane roared overhead, the 2 women walking past hand in hand added to his confusion. Who are these people? What had he come to? His father was asking the very same questions. We'd driven a mere 15 kilometres. We were in the same city in which we lived our whole lives, and yet it felt like we were in another country. Over the following 7 years, we slowly came to know these people, and we discovered that we were living in the midst of 2 distinct subcultures. One was the yuppie subculture, interesting how words change so quickly, whose members occupied renovated terraces and factories. They were attracted by the vibe of the streets, cafes, bookshops and fringe films. They embraced numerous causes, most notably the plight of refugees, environmental sustainability and gay marriage. And then there was the battler subculture, consisting of the remnant working class and those living in government housing or boarding houses. For them, life was all about survival. We discovered that these two very different groups had one thing in common. They were deeply alienated from the evangelical church. And while each group perceived us differently, both were shaped by value systems that in their own way were diametrically opposed to the values of evangelical Christianity. So we exchanged our four-wheel drive for a Prius and spent the next 7 years trying to understand how to become a church that would bring the gospel to these divergent groups of people. He says he came to realise that he had to think about his parish in Leichhardt in the same way that a missionary would think about their new context, to learn the skill of contextualisation, to take the gospel as it's understood in one culture, his, and to translate it for the recipient culture. We have so many different cultures in Australia at this time. And the differences, we talk about differences between Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne and perhaps Auckland, but even within those cities, there's so much difference. I mean, just, the differences between, say, Newtown and Newport in Sydney could fill a book. So many different subcultures. And to understand, we need to understand our culture in order for us to speak into it so that we can contextualise our message and communicate effectively. Sadly, I think that there's an image that I often think of when I think of non-contextualisation, and it's when I see a brother standing at Central or Flinders Station with black and white billboards saying repent, proclaiming punitive doom in King James language to a context that simply cannot decipher or understand the message anymore. Culture is a very slippery term. There's an image of cafe culture. That's from Auckland for our New Zealand friends. It's a slippery term. It's so broad. The scholar Greg Urban said culture is a thing that moves through time and space, but it has no Newtonian mass. So we can never sort of take hold of it, but it's a thing and it moves through time and space. It moves by a process of replication from one person to another. So, for instance, the cafe culture had to start with someone somewhere and then was replicated to the extent now that I think we probably export it. To the extent now when I drive to the office at church in the morning, I'll pass school children travelling along with their takeaway lattes. So, culture just moves from person to person. Richard Dawkins says it moves by a process of what he calls memes, cultural replicators that operate along the same kind of principles, the same kind of evolutionary algorithm as biological things do. Another scholar, Goodenough, said that a society's culture consists of whatever it is that a person has to know or believe in order to operate in a manner that is acceptable to its members. So in England, there are certain ways where you have to operate. If you're drowning, apparently don't yell help, okay? You have to actually raise your hand and say, excuse me, sir, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I wonder if you'd mind helping me, if you've actually got a moment, if that's okay. or there's the queue culture, the British queue culture, and we have it in Australia too. We're very well behaved in our queuing. But not long ago, I was in Transit Airport in Abu Dhabi, and I discovered that different cultures have very different ways of queuing as they go through security checks and so on. Speaking of culture, the missionary Linwood Barney said that it was like an onion, that a culture, when we think about culture, there's so many different layers to think about. Right in the inner core is our worldview, our set of beliefs, our cultural narratives, what we believe about the world and about human nature. In the middle are all those human institutions and values that we believe in, for example, marriage. And then on the outer layer, we've got our customs, our rituals, all the stuff that we can easily observe, like cafe culture, for example. Some people criticise this onion model because they say it doesn't actually capture the fact that every layer affects each other. Maybe a web, if anyone wants to draw a web, might show it better. But I think it does show how we often think of culture as just that surface, but our culture has much deeper parts to it as well. Here's another example, a more detailed example of culture in the form of an onion. But in Australia, I thought we have a lot of onions. We've got a lot of, even in your own parish, you have so many different cultures and subcultures. And our next speakers are going to talk about some of those things. I'm going to introduce all the next three speakers at once, and they're going to get up one after another. Claire Madden's going to be first, and Claire is a social researcher and Director of Research at the internationally recognised McCrindle Research. She is a next-gen expert, fluent in social media, youth culture and engagement styles of those generations. She is well equipped to help us bridge the gap between ourselves and these emerging generations and to suggest some engagement strategies that we ought to develop. After Claire, we've got Simon Smart. Simon is a director at the Centre for Public Christianity. He was formerly an English and history teacher. He has written several books. He studied at Regent College in Canada, and he's going to talk to us about some of the challenges and obstacles that our mission faces and how to make the best of it. In his terms, the shape and posture of public engagement in these days. And then finally, we've got Julianne Laird. She is in her 16th year of University Ministry for Christian Union at Melbourne University, and she still loves it. Previously, she worked as an assistant chaplain. That must seem a long time ago. She's also the chair of Lausanne in Australia and the Victoria coordinator for Arrow Leadership. And her viewpoint really is from the trenches of student evangelism and discipleship ministry. So she's going to help us to understand the shifts in our culture that we see there and how to respond. Okay, please welcome Claire Madden.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and good afternoon to you all. It's a great privilege to be here with you today as we look at this changing society in which we live. So, Tracy talked about how Kodak and these transitions that we need to make are so critical, because if there really was a word that explained the times in which we live, that word would be change. And it's not just that there is change today, but it's unprecedented in its speed, in its scale, in its scope. And at McCrindle, we are passionate about demographics and numbers and trends, and really what I love, a verse that I love that sums that up for me, is in 1 Chronicles chapter 12 verse 32. It's just hidden in there, and it says that the sons of Issachar understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And so understanding the times is so key in our strategy and being able to respond to these times. If we think about 5 years ago, if I said to you an apple, the first apple you would have thought about was probably one of these. But now if I do a Google Images search, the first apple that comes on a Google Images search is one of these. 5 years ago, to post meant to put a letter in one of these, and it was often to just one individual, one person that you knew. Now to post means to share a thought on a social media site that could go to hundreds of people, many of whom you don't necessarily even know. 5 years ago, tweets, they came from a bird that looked like this. Now we have over 500 million tweets coming from this little guy every single day. 5 years ago, tablets, they were the things that you swallowed when you weren't feeling too well. Today, a tablet is that device which many of you be holding and taking notes on and searching the internet on. Clouds, now they were the things in the sky. Fancy that. Yes, they're still there, but the cloud that we talk about is that place that somehow magically stores all of our documents. Such extraordinary change just within 5 years. And if we go back even to just 2 decades, when Generation Z were born, so Generation Z were born since 1995. They're school students of today, those who are entering university. If we look what was happening back then when they were born. In 1997, Google was registered as a domain. Only in 1997, you remember the first time that you used Google. We had portable MP3 players, USB flash drives in the year 2000, along with the Nokia 3310. The Nokia 3310. Anyone still using the Nokia 3310? Fantastic. That's great. Well, I'm sure it's still working. That's the thing about those bricks. And, I mean, why would you change it when you could play Snake on that thing, you know? I just don't think Candy Crush compares to what Snake gave us. We have had Wikipedia, MySpace, YouTube, which now has over 100 hours of content uploaded every single minute on that site. That equates to 115 years of content being uploaded every single week. So you could just watch this week's uploads for the rest of your life and you wouldn't get through them all. Facebook opened to the public just in 2006. We've had Dropbox, the iPhone in 2007, WhatsApp, iPads, Instagram, Siri, We've had Facebook reaching 1 billion users 6 years after it is launched. You've got GoPros, 3D printers, Google Glass. It's just extraordinary. If we think about how this has changed communities, social media and all of that, and if we go back to baby boomers and what they had as social media, it was one of these. The old teledecks. Anyone still got one of those as their form of social media? Yeah, there's a few in every crowd. That's fantastic. You just hold on to that thing. That'll be worth a lot on eBay one of these days. So retro. It's so cool. So only occasionally in history do massive demographic shifts combined with huge social change and ongoing generational transitions and rapid technological change and trends so that within the span of a few decades, society altogether alters. And that really is the context in which we're living today. That is the speed of change we're seeing in all these areas. Why do we need to be aware of this? Why do we need to be responsive? It was like what Tracy was talking about with some of those organisations. I've got a sign here. It's an important safety sign that says if you're drowning, call 911. And there's someone trying not to drown. They've got their arms up, trying not to drown. But when you see that sign, what do you see? You see LOL, don't you? Which is short for laugh out loud. Not to be confused with some baby boomers who've known it to be lots of love, but it's laugh out loud generally. And you see, drowning is no laughing matter. Yes, that sign was entirely appropriate a number of years ago. Now it's completely irrelevant because of our changing context. So the context we're in affects the way that we communicate. So what is our changing context, just briefly, socially and spiritually? Well, Australia is growing. And you've got some infographic cards there, one that has a map of Australia on it, and we've tried to put as much demographic data on there as we could. I guarantee if you memorise all the stats on this, you'll do brilliantly at your next trivia night. And you can see here Australia is going to reach 24 million people at the end of this year. The world is currently at 7.2 billion people. We have doubled both our national and our global population just since 1966. But Australia is growing at a faster rate than the world, which is growing at 1.0% at the moment. Australia is growing at 1.6% per annum. That's about a new Canberra every single year. And so we're growing at a faster rate. We're the fastest growing nation in the OECD. OECD nations on average grow at 0.6% per annum. We're growing almost 3 times as fast as that. So we're a growing nation. How are we growing? Well, 40% of our growth is from natural increase, which is births minus deaths. 60% of our growth is from net overseas migration. And Tracy mentioned the cultural diversity which we experience. And a lot of our growth comes from that. What's happening when it comes to religion? What's growing there? Well, according to the last census, which was in 2011, 61.1% of Australians still identified with Christianity. They still tick that Christianity box, over 6 in 10 Australians. What's the next biggest category? Well, it's actually the no religion category. 31.6% of Australians either identified as not religious or they chose not to answer that question because it's optional on the census. And so you can see there, you've got a significant proportion of Australians who are saying not religious or not engaging in that way. Well, what's the next biggest religion in Australia? It's actually Buddhism at 2.5%, followed by Islam, which makes up 2.2% of Australia, and then you've got all the other religions combined at 2.6%. It puts it in perspective, doesn't it? And so what's growing? It's that no religion category. This is the growth of no religion over the years. In 1971, it became an option on the census to write no religion if you didn't have one, so that's why it jumps up there. So it's a bit of methodological change from the previous census, but you can see the consistent growth there. It's now at 22.5% of Australians identifying as with no religion, and you can see that trend line. What's happening with church attendance? Whilst we've got that 61.1% of Australians identifying as Christian, according to the National Church Life Survey data, you've got just 15% of Australians who are regularly attending church. That means at least once per month. And you can see the trend line in that opposite direction there, which is something that we need to be aware of and look at how can we re-engage our society, our culture with the church. They're warm towards Christianity, they're ticking that box, but there's a massive gap who then is turning up to church. In some of the research we did, we asked Australians why they don't go to church, and the overwhelming response was, it's irrelevant to my life. And so we need to bridge that communication gap, and like Tracy was talking about, the need to communicate in a way that the people can understand. 47% are saying it's irrelevant to my life. 26% say they don't accept how it's taught, and 24% say the style is outdated. So as we look at Australia from 1976 to today, our population in Australia was 13.9 million people then. Today we're over 23 million people. We've grown by 10 million people in that period of time. What's happened to the church population in that time? Well, it used to be 3.9 million, today it's 3.5 million. So whilst we've added 10 million people to our population, our church population has actually declined by 400,000. So you can see the challenges that we have. So in a summary, in that period of time, Christianity has declined by 22%, church attendance by 48%, and no religion has increased by 269%. So that no religion area is actually growing across every age group. This is a graph, it's a little bit technical, but it shows the change in age groups reporting no religion between the last two censuses. So over a 5-year period, across different age groups, was there growth in people identifying with no religion? And there was actually growth across every age group, but what you can see there is it really peaks in that young adult age group. That's where there was significant increase over that 5-year period of numbers of people identifying with no religion. So Australia is not only growing, but we are changing. 1 in 4 Australians were not actually born here, so we are incredibly culturally diverse. When you look at households that have at least one parent born overseas, you've got 46% of households in that category with at least one parent born overseas. Now, sometimes we wonder how migration might be affecting Christianity numbers, and perhaps we think maybe migration is boosting that 61.1%. But when we look at migration and we look at the where Christianity is stronger, the top 4, this is Australians who were born in a different country and their likelihood to respond to identify with Christianity. So it's stronger, it's overrepresented in the top 4 countries there, Southern Europe, Western Europe, and so forth. They're overrepresented. But our migration traditionally came from there, but now is increasingly coming from Asian countries, and they are the bottom 4 who are likely to identify with Christianity. You can see Central Asia, just 22% of Australians born in Central Asia identify with Christianity. And so you can see there the migration is not actually boosting the Christianity numbers, but the opposite. We're also changing in Australia. Our local communities are changing, and we're moving more frequently than ever before. We're moving house, we're moving jobs, and this increased mobility is seen. We've got 31% of Australians rent a house. Those renters are moving on average every 1.8 years. You've got almost a third of your community moving house every 1.8 years. What does that mean for your congregation? What does that mean for your church in engaging people more quickly as they come, and the churn and change that we're seeing? Even those who are paying a mortgage are moving every 8 years on average, and those who fully own their house every 18 years. They're also moving for jobs, and you would notice that increased change and mobility of people in your congregations who are moving more frequently. Over the lifetime of a Gen Z, it's estimated they will have 5 careers and they will have 17 jobs. And so that change and churn impacts how our communities look. It's not going to be the same people living in the same community, local neighbourhood for decades. There'll be so much more change and churn now. And so how can we engage with our local community, which is constantly rotating? Just because the community might know that your church exists, 2 years ago, that community has changed significantly in that 2-year period. And so the need to constantly re-engage with your people in your local neighbourhood. Well, we're also changing with how how educated we are in formal education. So whilst 1 in 10 builders generation have a university degree, 1 in 5 baby boomers do, it's 1 in 4 Gen X, 1 in 3 Gen Y, and it's projected that 1 in 2 Gen Zs will be university educated. And what impact does this have? Well, interestingly, the ABS data shows there's a correlation between those who identify as not religious and how educated they are at university. So you can see the trend line there. So if their highest level of education is school education, about 20% will tick the no religion box. By the time they get to a postgraduate degree, it's it's about 32% who are identifying as not religious. So you can see there's an impact in our education system and the impact that that has on people's engagement with faith. And as we're becoming a more university-educated society, what does that mean? What implications does that have in how we engage and on what level of discourse we can engage? This shift to the secularization of our society we've seen in a number of ways. When it comes to where people come to church, it's often at Easter and Christmas, and it's around those events like weddings and funerals. Interestingly, today 70% of all weddings are conducted by civil celebrants, just 30% by religious ministers. Even of funerals, over half, 58% of funerals today are conducted by civil celebrants. 1998 was the last year where we had more weddings conducted by religious ministers than civil celebrants. So you can see the shift that's happened in that period of time. I know this is like a mega stat download at you, but you've got a lot of this info in your infographic cards. We've got these ones that we've put on your seats as well, which sums up a lot about that Christianity in Australia and what's happening there. We put this together for Christian Venues Association, looking at the impacts of Christian camps on people's faith journey. And it's got a big summary there at the front of that on Christianity in Australia. A lot of that data is from National Church Life Survey, which we're able to incorporate and analyse there as well. So Australia is also ageing. In 1985, our population pyramid looks like this. What that means is there are a lot more younger people than there were older people, which is why it's a pyramid shape. Today, our population pyramid looks more like this. And as we look forward to 2045, our pyramid is becoming a bit more like some kind of rectangular shape as people are going to be living longer, and we're on the brink of incredible ageing population as the baby boomers are reaching retirement age there. And so what's the impact of this? Well, here in 2045 is the first time that our population pyramid really is inverted, because you've got more people aged over 60 than you do aged under 18 in that year, in year of 2045. We do have a baby boom going on at the same time. We've got record births, over 310,000 babies being born every year in Australia. We've got this growth at both ends as there's more hitting that ageing population, and they're also going to be living a lot longer. So when we look at the median age of an Australian aged 15 and over, that median age is 43. Of an Australian in general, it's 37.3, but we've got rid of the under 15s because we wanted to be able to align it with National Church Life Survey data, which shows the average age of an Australian who attends church. And the average church attender is age 53. So there's a decade gap there. So the average church attender is older by a decade there than the average Australian. This is our Australian population broken down by generation. And as we overlay here the church population, you can see what's happening. Basically, at this upper end is where we've got our older Australians. So the over 80s make up 5% of the population there. They make up 9% of the church population. The people in their 70s make up 7% of the national population, 16% of the church population. You can see they're also overrepresented in the 60s, making up 19% of the church population, just 12% of the national population. By the time we get to our 40s, the people in that Gen X age group are about on par. What starts to happen after that is you see that the younger generations are significantly underrepresented in the church. I think this tells us two things. It tells us that we have a lot of ministry to do to our church populations, which are a lot of them are going to be in that older age group, but it also shows us the need to engage with the younger generations, because as we project this a few decades on, if we haven't engaged that younger generation in the church, it's going to have a significant impact on the landscape of Australia and Australia engaging with Christianity. In summary, we've got 24% of our population are aged over 60 and 44% of the church population are aged over 60. Yet the National Church Life Survey data shows that of church attenders, this is of people who are sitting in your church on a weekend, 4 in 5 of them first made their first faith decision to become a Christian before the age of 20. So the data is showing that people, whatever age they are now, they say, I made my first faith decision under the age of 20, 4 in 5 of them. And so it shows the need to engage with that cohort who are in the shaping years of their life, who are making those faith decisions as they are finding their identity and all that's going on in that under 20 age group. It's a significant time for people to make that faith decision. So with all of that, we asked a question to Australians about what they thought about the church in our society. And whilst many of them say they don't go and they feel like it's irrelevant to their life, we said, is church beneficial for your society? Well, we got an overwhelming yes. 88% of Australians said, yes, church is beneficial for my society. And so there's this kind of disengagement. They think, yep, tick the box, it's good for my society, but I personally don't feel a need to go. Or I personally don't think it's relevant. So how can we engage with Australians? How can we engage with the eyes of their head as well as the eyes of their heart? How can we engage both rationally and emotionally to show them the need for this? Or as this meme says, how can we make sure we engage them? Well, I think there's a couple of things we can remember. The shift from complexity to clarity. We're living in incredibly complex times. It's so much more complex now to get a message to get cut through, isn't it? There's so much more just fighting for the attention of your people in your community all the time. We're so easily entertained on our devices, or distracted, I should say, often is the case, on devices, on media, on how busy our lives are. And there's a lot of complexity in people's worlds now. And so to make it, bring a message of clarity about the relevance of church to their life, to help them understand clearly that need in our communities is key. Here's a clear solution to a complex problem. In this whole era of technology, I find the most complex technology is still the good old remote control. There are too many buttons on that thing. And my grandma often calls saying, how do I get the DVD player to work? Well, my sister found this and thought it was an appropriate image to send to our family WhatsApp group, helping grandma with the controller. You're simply just masking tape 90% of the buttons and the thing will work. We need to get clarity with our message. We need to get a clear message cutting through to our community about the gospel and the relevance of the gospel and church in their world. To the shift from superficiality to substance for our culture, for our community. We're living in a world where we're bombarded with communication and messages all the time, and there's an oversaturation of all of this. We're in a world where we can just Google it. And so we don't need to ask grandma anymore or ask dad how that thing worked. We just Google it if we need to find an answer. But we're living often on that level of just broad information, but not necessarily going deep. There's a decline in young people's higher level thinking skills because of this world in which we're living, where it's often so superficial. But we know that the gospel is a message of substance, that Christ is our substance. And so we can offer an authentic community in our churches, one of substance, one that is real, one where it's more than just liking a post. And I love a passage, be the first of your friends to like this post. It's going to take more than that to build our authentic community within the communities in which we live. There's a great passage in 1 Corinthians 4:15 where Paul says, you have 10,000 teachers but few fathers, and for this reason I became a father. There's 10,000 messages, 10,000 friends on Facebook and whatever it might be, but few fathers, few mentors, few people who get alongside them, speak into them, and really just help guide their life through these incredibly complex times. The other shift is from apathy to action. We're in a society where all we need to do to be entertained now is just pick this up and just, and click. We can become quite apathetic in our culture, and we also need to be front-footed in engaging. How can we be front-footed in engaging all the generations that we saw there on that, and not be like this person who was painting the road sign and couldn't be bothered moving that little stick there. They just painted around it. Let's see how we can engage. Anyway, there's far more information about this infographic and these reports, which are available at the back desk as well, which we put together for Christian venues. But I hope that's given you a quick overview about some of the trends in our society and why we need to engage. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was great. Claire, that was depressing. We thought it would be depressing. A bit like a cholesterol test where, you've got to go, you've got to listen, but it's a hard pill to take. Simon, thank you for helping us to understand our cultural narratives and challenges and reminding us that we're in Athens, not in Jerusalem anymore. And Julianne, for your tips. Sometimes, as I was preparing for this session, I thought it feels a bit like a perfect storm. There's sort of like, there's all these things coming that are, against the church at the moment and against our success in mission. It can feel like a perfect storm, but there actually are lots of opportunities. We can detect openings. Even that some of the phrases that we use in society these days, like, if I ring ahead, I'm on my way home from work and I ring ahead and I talk to one of my daughters and I say, what would you like for dinner? Would you like me to pick up some Chinese or Andrew's hamburgers, or should I get a pizza? And, after a few minutes she says, oh, whatever. We're so saturated in choice. It's a cry of frustration, that word, whatever. We've got too much on and we need alternatives. We've got this supermarket of lifestyles available, but there's a hunger for coherence. There's a longing for identity that reaches beyond just the me that we've grown up on. I thought I'd close with something that allows us to think about how we respond to what we've heard. And you may have heard of this story of the shoe manufacturer who sends a salesman to a developing country to see what kind of market there is for shoes. Sends 2 salesmen, and one of them says, forget it, no one wears shoes here. And the other one says, wow, send a container, no one's wearing shoes here. So there is great opportunity for us. And I wanted to close with a challenge to say, having heard all of this, in your ministry, what do you need to be doing differently to engage with our missionary context? What do you need to be doing differently to engage appropriately with our missionary context? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My assistant down here is going to distribute some gifts to our friends. Would you thank them again? What a splendid job they've done this afternoon in helping us grapple with these issues. But it's not over because we're about to, after a little coffee break, we're moving into our workshops.